Alright, and welcome now to our second lesson on biological molecules. In the last lesson we looked at the properties and functions of water, and in this lesson we're going to look at carbohydrates. Carbs, you know, the sound that sends girls going, carbs, avoid carbs. But actually carbohydrates are incredibly important for your diet, so we're going to have to learn about them anyway. Now when we're learning about nutrients, we need to think about several important questions. So for the rest of this lecture series, whenever you talk about a certain nutrient, you need to think about what chemical elements does it contain, right? What is its structure? How it makes up the nutrients? What kind of different types of forms does it come in? And importantly, what are its functions in the body? So notice the important theme alert: structure and function. So for carbohydrates, we're going to be talking about the types of elements, the different types of carbohydrates, and what their functions are. And in your textbook, you can find this from page 53 to 59. Right, so let's get started. Right, carbs are everywhere. Right, they're not just found in your breads and rice and pasta. All of the following foods are examples of carbs, even found in vegetables and fruits, and we'll see why later. In your milk and dairy products, candies and desserts. So carbs are a very diverse group of nutrients and very relevant to our everyday life. So just looking at the word carbohydrates, you get an idea of the kinds of chemical elements that you find inside carbohydrates. You look at carbo and you think of carbon, and you look at hydrates and you think of hydration, you think of water, right, which is made out of hydrogen and oxygen. So carbohydrates contain carbon, they contain hydrogen and oxygen. And also importantly, hydrogen and oxygen are in a 2:1 ratio, so 2 times the amount of hydrogen compared to oxygen. And the most famous example of carbohydrates would be glucose. And glucose has the chemical formula C6H12O6. So that means that there are 6 carbon atoms, right, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms in one molecule of glucose. So you see how that fits the criteria, right? Contains carbon and hydrogen and oxygen in a 2:1 ratio. So now moving on to what are the types of carbohydrates. We've already talked about glucose. Now I want you to think back on your lower secondary school years, right? What are the other types of carbohydrates you have learned about before? Here's some clues. One starts with S and one starts with M. So hopefully you thought of starch and you thought of maltose. Give yourself a pat on the back if you got it. Now here's a diagram of glucose, starch, and maltose. So hopefully you also remember that glucose is kind of the simplest form of carbohydrates, just got one kind of ring, and maltose is made out of 2 glucose molecules, and starch is made out of many hundreds and thousands of glucose molecules altogether. I want to introduce you a simple way of classifying carbohydrates. So how we classify them is that glucose and maltose are simple carbohydrates or sugars, right? And starch, being a very, very large molecule made out of many, many small units of glucose, is a complex carbohydrate, right? It's more complex, it's larger. So simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. So we can also show this in a diagram form. We have all carbohydrates can be divided into simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. Right, and we can further divide simple carbohydrates into 2 groups. We can divide it into single sugars, like glucose, 1 ring, or double sugars, like maltose, 2 rings. And in complex carbohydrates, we have very large, very, very large molecules like starch. So just get familiar with this big picture first, before we zoom in on each type of carbohydrate. And we're going to be starting with single sugars. So what are single sugars? Well, another name for them is monosaccharides, right? Mono means 1, and saccharides means sugars. So one sugar, okay, because it's only made up of one ring, right? So this is the smallest and simplest form of carbohydrates, and because they're very small, they can pass through the cell membrane of cells. So for single sugars, we have a few common examples. Right, I've already talked about glucose, that's a single sugar, and you might also have heard of fructose and galactose. Right, fructose is found mostly in plants, and galactose is a single sugar that is found in your milk. Now, interestingly, glucose, fructose, and galactose all have the same chemical formula. Right, all of them are C6H12O6. But the difference lies in how those atoms are arranged. Right, so if you're interested, you can go and look more into that. But they have different properties because the atoms are arranged in different ways. So moving on to the double sugars, right? The name for double sugars is disaccharides, because di means two, right? Di means two, and saccharides means sugars. So under double sugars, we've already seen the example of maltose. And maltose is made out of a molecule of glucose joined to another molecule of glucose. Now, you could also have heard of sucrose, right? Commonly used in a lot of O-level questions. Sucrose is actually glucose together with fructose. And there's also lactose, which you have definitely heard about. Maybe your friends are like lactose intolerant. Right? Lactose is a milk sugar found in milk. It's made out of glucose and galactose. So these are three common examples of double sugars. Okay, I say the most important is probably to remember maltose. So far we've talked about both glucose, a single sugar, and maltose, a double sugar. Now you realize that, as we look at these things, that actually food contains many large and complex molecules that are formed from smaller basic units. So for example, maltose is made up of two glucose molecules. Now a question that you might have at this point is, right, how are larger molecules, like maltose, formed from smaller ones, like glucose? Right, how are they joined together? Right, it's not just stuck together by glue, right? So how are they joined together? So the secret of joining two smaller molecules together is a reaction called the condensation reaction. Now, when have you heard this word condensation before? You're probably thinking about, the condensation on your car window or the condensation in your water bottle. Okay, and you're not that far off. Okay, condensation has something to do with water. So what a condensation reaction is that two molecules are joined together with the removal or production of one water molecule. So for example, two glucose molecules here, and voila, by condensation, we get a maltose molecule. Two of them are joined together, but you get the production or the removal of one water molecule. Right? It just comes out as a product of the reaction. Okay, so that's a condensation reaction. Now, the opposite of condensation is a reaction called hydrolysis. Hydro meaning water, and lysis meaning breakdown. So hydrolysis is basically using water to break down larger molecules into smaller molecules, right? So larger molecules are broken down into smaller molecules by hydrolysis. It involves the addition of water. So take a look at this. Maltose is here, and we have the addition of one water molecule. Now, these hydrolysis reactions usually involve enzymes. So in the case of maltose, the enzyme is, hopefully you remember, maltase. So maltose, with the addition of water, with the help of an enzyme called maltase, can be broken down into two molecules of glucose. So this is hydrolysis. Right, so to sum up, to join molecules together, we have condensation, and to break them down, we have hydrolysis. So with that in mind, let's move on to the complex carbohydrates. Right, this group of carbohydrates, we call them the polysaccharides. Right, poly meaning many, right, like your polytechnic, because they teach many different types of skills. Right, and polysaccharides are made up of many monosaccharides, for example, glucose, which are joined together by what reaction? What did we just learn? What are they joined together by? Joined together by condensation. Alright? And the three examples of complex carbohydrates which you need to know are starch, cellulose, and glycogen. So of course, complex carbohydrates are complex because they're made up of many smaller molecules. Right? This is quite a funny joke. So sometimes some of us are quite complex, like these complex carbohydrates, thinking about your purpose in life, what's the meaning in life. And this bread, I don't know what he's thinking about. It was quite funny. Okay, but let's move on, as this is totally not relevant to our lesson. And let's talk about starch. Right, starch, as you know, is made up of many glucose molecules which are joined together. And it is a storage form of carbohydrates in plants, like in your potatoes and in many of your plant organs, right? Starch is found there. And if you think of it, it's like a row of students all standing together, holding hands, right? That's the glucose molecules all joined together. Next up, we have cellulose, which is the component of your plant cell wall, and also makes up the dietary fiber which you eat in many vegetables and fruits, and which comes out glamorously out of your bottom. Well, cellulose is also made up of many glucose molecules which are joined together. And it looks a bit like starch, right? Glucose joined together. But the difference is that the bonds between glucose are a little bit different. So the glucose molecules are linked together differently compared to starch. So if you imagine the people, again, standing in a row, in starch, they were all facing the front. But in cellulose, right, every alternate person is facing a different direction. So the glucose molecules are just joined a bit differently. And that's what makes cellulose different from starch. And finally, we have glycogen. Now, immediately you see that glycogen looks very different because it is a branched molecule. Right? It is branched and it's also made up of many glucose molecules, except now there are some branches. Now, this is the main storage form of carbohydrates in animals, such as in us, right? You can find glycogen in our liver, where we store glucose in the form of glycogen. So having looked at all the different types of carbohydrates, we have seen that they play several different functions. Right? Firstly, they are a very quick source of energy, right? An immediate source of energy. For instance, glucose, of course, we know is broken down inside the mitochondria during respiration to produce energy. Right? Carbohydrates are also used to make support structures, such as cellulose is used in making the cell wall. And finally, carbohydrates are used to synthesize other compounds. For instance, the body uses glucose to synthesize amino acids, to synthesize fats. So glucose is a very basic nutrient which the body can use to synthesize other compounds. So just a slight extension question, why do different carbohydrates, for instance starch and cellulose, have slightly different functions? So we know that starch is used in the storage of energy, while cellulose is used in making the cell wall. Right? Why do they have different functions? Well, the difference in function actually lies in their difference in structure. So remember that starch and cellulose have different arrangements of glucose. Well, that leads them to have many very different chemical properties and therefore different functions. So again, the structure is linked to function. So let's apply what we just learned. Now, what properties make starch and glycogen suitable to be used as storage forms in plants and animals? Well, the first thing is that they are both insoluble in water and they do not affect the water potential of cells. Now imagine if cells stored energy in the form of glucose. So they just accumulated a lot of glucose inside them. What will happen? Now if you remember from osmosis, water will move into the cell, causing it to expand and in animal cells to burst, kaput. Well, if you accumulate starch and glycogen in a cell, that wouldn't happen because they cannot dissolve in water. So the water potential is not affected. Well, secondly, starch and glycogen are very large, so they cannot move out of the cell easily. And even though they are large, they are actually more compact, so they take up less space than if we had stored energy as individual glucose molecules. And still, they can be broken down easily into glucose. So that's all.